So, good afternoon, everybody. So, welcome to my second lecture. Well, first of all, I would like to start with a couple of remarks concerning yesterday. So, how many of you did try the exercise? Yes? No, come on, this is a school. Well, okay, if at some point you feel brave enough to start playing with correlation functions for matrix plot states and so on, you will find something like this, okay? Essentially that your 3-point correlation function decomposes some products of the two-body correlation functions, okay? So this is kind of a big theorem for matrix plot states, and what it means is that when you have the two-body correlation function, you can essentially compute any other correlation function from an MPS, okay? So what I'm saying here is this is a correlator between 1 and 2, between 2 and 3. This is the product of correlators between 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, okay? Then there is some constant. And there is no correlator between 1 and 3 because, well, this is a 1D system, and therefore you can just not move things in a 1D system. Okay, so you should get something like this. Second remark about yesterday is that at some point I said that the entanglement entropy had 3 properties, that it did not increase under LOCC, that it was continuous, and also I said that it was additive. And then I said that the Renyi entropies were not additive, concerning a remark made by you, but then Mari Carmen and Glenn pointed me out after the talk that the Renyi entropies are actually additive, so I had to revise what I said. And it's actually not that the entanglement entropy is additive. There are a couple of much stronger conditions for the entanglement entropy. The first one is subadditivity, and this is not verified by the Renyi entropies, and there is even one that is very, very strong, which is called strong subadditivity, which is this inequality here, and this was only proven recently. And well, if you assume these conditions here, entanglement entropy is pretty much the unique measure that we know that satisfies all these things. Okay? So this is just a remark concerning what I said yesterday. So,
strong additivity.
Strong subadditivity.
Strong subadditivity is also necessary condition for
Yeah. So far, I think that this has only been proven for the entanglement entropy. Okay, and it was a very, very hard proof. So it was proven recently. Okay. So any questions concerning what I explained yesterday about MPS, about entanglement, Smith decompositions, and so on? It's all clear. Okay. Okay, so today I'm gonna tell you about a very different story. We are going to jump from 1D to 2D, and I will explain you about projected entangled pair states. Okay, that's what my talk today is going to be. And today I switched to the slides because you will see that the tensor networks that I have to paint very soon, they become very complicated to paint on the blackboard very quickly, and therefore I will spend here my whole life painting diagrams, and I don't want to do that. Okay. So instead of that, I use the slides, and I think we can be much more efficient. So today's talk is going to be about simulating 2D systems, and now we already know everything about entanglement and so on, and we'll see why these PEPs are actually a good thing to do in 2D. So this was the outline. We already did the first part, we did yesterday. We talked about entanglement and how this motivated the picture of MPS in 1 dimensions. And today I will be talking about PEPs. First I will tell you about some basic properties of PEPs. Okay? Then I will tell you typical manipulations that one has to do in order to compute things with PEPs, things such as expectation values, time evolution, optimization of wave functions, and so on and so forth. Then I will tell you what are the tricks to do fermions in 2D. So with PEPs, and in particular with tensor networks, we don't have any sign problem or anything like that. So there are several approaches to do fermions, and in particular I will explain you one of them. And in the end, I will just explain you some other further topics that may be related to PEPs, and some of them which are also a little bit general. Okay? Good, so let's start with the basics. And now the point is, why do we want PEPs at all? So we know that matrix plot states are great, and they work very well for gap 1-dimensional systems because of the things that I explained yesterday. But the point is that, well, physics is not only in 1D, and we want to go beyond 1D systems. So I don't know, we have things like graphene, we have things like 3D solid state physics, and so on. And you know, this is painful for DMRZ. So if any of you have played with 2-dimensional DMRZ in 2D and so on, you know this is pretty hard, okay? And the reason is that, well, MPS capture very well the structure of entanglement in 1D systems, but not in 2D, 3D, and so on, okay? So the point is that, well, we are just going to generalize this tensor network to something two-dimensional. And we call this projected entangled pair states, or sometimes I also call it tensor product states. Depends a little bit on what is the reference that you read. Nowadays, I think that this notation of PEPs is more convenient. The reason why they are called PEPs is because of this picture in terms of singlets and projectors that I mentioned yesterday. Okay? So for instance, this is a PEPs for a 2D system on a 3x3 lattice, and this time we have a 2D contraction of tensors. This is a PEPs for a 3D system, and so on and so forth. Okay? So for the sake of this talk, I will be focusing on 2D. And many of the things that I will say, some of them apply also to 3D, some other not, but I will be focusing on 2D systems. And actually, Philippe Corvos will also be here probably, I don't know if next week or in 2 weeks, and he will also be talking about simulations in 2D. Okay? So he will, if you don't get the idea now, you will have a second chance, let's say. Okay? Good. So let's start with a little bit let me give you the intuition of why PEPs are a little bit hard, okay? So Mari Carmen is smiling, I know she will do that, because this is a sentence of Michael Lubach, who was a student when we were both at the Max Planck Institute, and he was very happy programming matrix product states, okay? And he was a happy guy, no? And and then if you program matrix product states, I mean, it may be a little bit hard at the beginning, but everything flows, okay? And in the end, I mean, it's like dancing with a ballerina. This is why I'm putting this here, because you have canonical forms. You can do your optimizations very efficiently. Everything scales like the power of 3 or something like this. You can do, I don't know, irreducible representations of symmetries, such as Masagi was explained yesterday. So everything flows, okay? It's complicated, but everything is fine, okay? And now you go to 2D, and what you have is this. Okay, so it's like trying to dance with an elephant, and at the beginning you don't know what to do. Okay, so everything is like very clumsy. You try something, it doesn't work. You try something else, it also doesn't work. You realize your computer crashes. You have to come back, see why it's unstable. These kind of things. Okay, and it's really there is really a qualitative and quantitative jump when going from MPS to PEPs, because there are many things that happen here that you just don't see them. You just deal with matrix product states. Okay? But this is the reason why it's first important to play a little bit with MPS, because then you more or less know what to do with this. So this is the reason why PEPs are not your friends, okay, as Michael mentioned. And he started programming PEPs, and suddenly he started trying to dance with this elephant, and he started it was hard at the beginning, but the message is that, well, if you dance a lot with this elephant, the elephant gets on shape, okay? And then the PEPs can actually be very good allies, and you can turn this elephant into something like a dragon, okay? And in the end, things work very well, okay? So this is kind of the image. It's very hard at the beginning, okay? So, but the point is, well, don't lose any hope, okay? Because if you play a lot with them, in the end, they work very well, okay? So that's a little bit of the message. Things are going to be much more complicated, but in the end, it's also much more rewarding. So let me tell you about 2 exact examples. Yes? Oh, yeah.
Do you also change the scaling from the elephant to the dragon so that would So what is the...
Yeah, not necessarily. Okay, so changing the scaling, you mean changing something like that? Yeah, no, you don't need to change the scaling. Okay, so the point is that, well, I mean, there are optimization strategies and contraction strategies that when you realize that they are much more efficient, suddenly you jump into the dragon, okay? But it's not necessary, okay? So there is a little bit of trade-off between efficiency and accuracy, okay? It's more than when you play a lot with PEPs, you realize that there are many tiny little computational tricks that you don't see with MPS, that they just happen for PEPs, okay? And you learn to take care of all of that, and in the end you get something consistent working. Okay, so let me tell you about 2 exact examples of PEPs. The first one is kind of a canonical example, is GitHub Story Code Model. This is a Hamiltonian. It's a Hamiltonian of spins 1/2 on the links of a square lattice, and well, the Hamiltonian is given by a sum of star and plaquette operators with Pauli matrices like this. And this model is very important because it's the simplest model we know having intrinsic topological order in 2D. And the remarkable property is that this model is exactly solvable, and all the eigenstates of this model can be written as a PEPs with bond dimension 2. Okay? And well, these are the tensors for the ground state, actually. So if you put these non-zero coefficients on a tensor, and you arrange it in terms of a PEPS, you actually get the ground state for this Hamiltonian. So this is an example of an exact wave function that is highly non-trivial, and you can represent it by a PEPS with bond dimension 2. Second example is a, yeah?
In the Toricot, if we put the ground state on the torus, there are four different ground state.
Yes.
How can we distinguish the?
Yeah. So these are the coefficients for the ground state on the infinite lattice. Okay. And when you grab it around a torus, it's one of these 4 ground states. And then to get the other 4, you have to apply these loop operators. But it's still they are still PEPs.
Local tensor.
Yeah.
In the same.
Yes. Well, it's essentially the same except for the places where you apply the loop operator. Okay. But it's still a PEPs with bond dimension 2 because the operator is local. It's something like sigma x, sigma x, sigma x, sigma x. Okay. More questions? Yeah.
So that means, so there are only 4 ground state on torus, so different PEPs representation with loop operator on different side gives you the same.
Give you the same physical wave function. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. More questions? Good. Okay. So the second example is the RBB state. Here I just write it as a sum over all the possible dimer coverings with singlets, with nearest neighbor singlets on a square lattice. And you know, this wave function is very interesting because it has been proposed by Anderson to understand some properties of high TC superconductivity, even though nowadays it's also interesting in the context of antiferromagnetism and things like this. But the point is that this wave function, it's very easy to write as an exact PEPS also with bond dimension 3. Okay? And here I don't prove it, but you just believe me that if you just pick up these 2 non-zero coefficients of your tensors and all the possible rotations thereof and arrange them like this, you actually have this state. Okay, after sitting down and thinking a little bit about it, you just realize that. So the RBB state is a PEPS with bond dimension 3. And well, there are many, many other examples, but these are just 2 examples that are kind of representative. Okay, good. So now the point is that we have PEPS, and this is an example of a finite PEPS for a 3x3 lattice, and we can also define PEPS for infinite systems if we just assume that we have a unit cell of tensors that is being repeated everywhere. Okay, for instance, we will have the same tensor being repeated at every site on the square lattice, and essentially we assume that we have translation invariants, and then we can also play with infinite PEPS. Okay. Now, what I would like to do now is to prove you that PEPS obey an area law for the entanglement entropy in 2 dimensions. And this is going to be, actually, the proof is going to be pretty general. So if you apply it also for MPS, you will get the 1D area law. If you apply it for the MERA, you will get this logarithmic scaling in 1D, and so on and so forth. Okay? But let's do it for 2D for the case of PEPS. So we start having a quantum state like this. This is a PEPS, okay, with bond dimension D. So for PEPS, I use bond dimension D. For MPS, I used yesterday bond dimension chi. Now the people of DMRG use M. Okay, and also the mathematicians use little d, I think, no? So there is this fundamental equation that d equals chi equals m equals little d and so on. And you have to keep it in mind, okay? So this is the bond dimension, but when I talk about d, I refer to the bond dimension of a PEPS, and when I talk about chi, I refer to the bond dimension of an MPS. So we now consider the block, a block of L times L sides in the lattice, and well, we have an inside part and an outside part. And I realized that, well, I can just do the following thing. If I just remove all the tensors inside, okay, I end up with a set of, well, I end up with a quantum state for the spins on the outside, and all these quantum states are just being labeled by the value of all these indices, okay? Now, the value of all these indices combined, I just combine it into a single index, and this index goes from 1 up to d to the power of 4L. This is just the multiplication of all the possible bond dimensions that I have in here, okay? So d times d times d times d and so on gives me d to the power of 4L. Okay? So this is a quantum state for the spins outside. Now I can do the same thing for the spins on the inside, right? And then I have, I have a quantum state for all the spins inside, and this is labeled by all these indices here, and I have again from 1 up to d to the 4L possibilities. And what this means is that, well, I can just pick up my generic quantum state and write it like that, where this thing is just a sum over all the possible states inside and all the possible states outside, and well, there are up to d to the 4L states in this sum. Now, if I want to compute, say, the reduced density matrix on the inside, this is, well, I just do the trace over the degrees of freedom on the outside, and I get something like this, right? I get some sum over projectors, okay, for the vectors on the inside, and then there are these matrices here, which are given by this thing. Actually, I'm running out of, no, battery is full, so I don't know what's going on. Let me, there is another pointer here.
Yeah, there is. I mean, you can see that.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's good. Thank you. So now I have two savers. Okay. Good. Let's see. So we have this, okay, and well, this is just a sum over all these projectors with all these matrices. Now, the point is that I can have up to d to the 4l terms in this sum, and this means that the rank of this reduced density matrix is going to be upper bounded by this number, okay. And now you just take the entanglement entropy, and you know that this is upper bounded by the rank, by the log of the rank of the reduced density matrix, and naturally what you get is this formula here. And well, what is this? This is just the size of the boundary, okay? And this is a prefactor that depends on the bond dimension. So this is it. This is an area law in 2D, okay? The entanglement entropy of a PEPS can never be larger than an area law in 2D, and the prefactor of the area law is given by your bond dimension. That's what is controlling the prefactor of the area. Okay? If you repeat the same thing in 1D, you will find that MPS obeys a 1D area law. If you repeat the same thing for a MERA, you will find that the MERA obeys an area law in the holographic dimension that we were discussing this morning, okay, and also all these days. And this is the way in which you compute entanglement entropies for tensor networks. Good. Now, that's a very important property of PEPS. Another very interesting property, which is very different with respect to 1D, is that the exact contraction is inefficient. And let me tell you what I mean by this. Imagine that I have a finite PEPS on an n times n lattice, and now I just want to compute, say, the norm. Okay? So this is my ket. Now this is my bra. And now to compute the norm, what I have to do is, well, I have to connect the indices, the physical indices here and here, and I have to contract the tensor network like this. Okay? Now you understand why I didn't want to paint these things on the blackboard, okay? Because this would just take me too much. Now the point is that I have to contract this 3D structure of tensors here, and well, a possible strategy, it's not unique, but a possible strategy would be the following thing. I could just sandwich the tensors from the ket and from the bra, okay? Something like this. And then define a 2D tensor network where I have these blue tensors here and these thick indices here. What it means is that we have actually double indices. Okay, there is one bond index coming from the bra, and another bond index coming from the ket. Okay, so they go from 1 up to d squared. And now, well, I have to contract this 2D lattice of tensors. Right? A possible strategy will be to, well, let's do it row by row. So I just start with the first row, and I contract all these guys together. So I have n of them. So I contract them. And the number of operations that they have to do is of the order of d to the power of 2n, very easy to see. And now I go to the second row, and the number of operations that I have to do is, again, this one, and so on and so forth, and I have to do this n times, right? Now, if I use this strategy, you can see that the computing time is going to be exponential in the linear size of the system, okay? So, you know, this is not efficient at all, right? Now you can think of, you could say, well, but maybe there is another strategy of contraction starting from a corner or from this tensor here and moving there and doing something that, you know, I go to some polynomial scaling. And well, this does not happen, okay? It doesn't matter how you try to contract a two-dimensional tensor network, you always go through some intermediate tensor that has many, many open legs, okay? And this means that you have exponentially many coefficients. What this means is that, well, actually, people have put this in formal grounds, and this is the mathematical statement. And the mathematical statement is that the exact contraction of a PEPS, say computing the norm or even evaluating a local expectation value, something like that, is a sharply hard problem, okay? So this is, in computational complexity, this is one of those classes of very, very hard problems, things that you cannot solve in polynomial time, or at least we don't know how to solve them in polynomial time, in the size of the system, okay? And this also applies for expectation values of observables. So if we want to compute them exactly, that's bad news because we cannot do it in polynomial time. Yes?
There was a recent paper on the archive, I think about contracting PEPs and putting it in like was that about approximate contractions?
It was, you mean the paper by Eisert and Wurzhapper and company?
Yeah,
yes.
So.
So they restrict to PEPs in to specific PEPs that are ground states of wrapped local Hamiltonians, and they say that they can approximate the contraction in quasi-polynomial time, which I don't know what it means. Okay, so I think, but it's a very specific thing. Okay, so here the claim is different: is that if you just have a generic PEPs, in principle you cannot contract it polynomially in polynomial time. But the point, and thanks for this question, because then I can say something very interesting, is that, but usual PEPs that we have in everyday life, they are not just arbitrary PEPs. They come from low energy eigenstates of local Hamiltonians in 2D, okay? And it turns out that for these Hamiltonians, it looks like we can approximate very well this contraction in polynomial time, even with a very, very good accuracy, okay? And therefore it means that, you know, the PEPs that we actually get in actual numerical simulations are constrained probably by locality, okay? And it means that they are just not arbitrary instances of PEPs, okay? They probably are the ones that can be contracted efficiently. But in general, this is the result, so it means that we have to develop approximate numerical schemes. Another very important property of PEPs, and this is also very different from matrix product states, is that PEPs can have infinite correlation length. So yesterday I proved that if you have a matrix product state, no matter which MPS you have, you always will get a finite correlation length. Okay, and you know, we develop all these correlators and so on, and I told you about this exercise. Now it turns out that in 2D, you can have infinite correlation length even with a finite bond dimension. Okay, and this is quite surprising, but for instance, this is a very simple example where this happens. If you consider this state, this is a very peculiar state, so if I compute the norm of this quantum state, what I get is the partition function of the classical Ising model. Okay? So all the expectation values in this quantum state, they are related to some classical expectation value of the classical Ising model in 2D. Now it turns out that it's been proven in this paper that it's actually pretty easy to write this state as a PEPs exactly with bond dimension 2, and these are the coefficients. Okay, there are some cosinus hyperbolics and so on, and these guys come because we have some exponentials. And this is exact. It has bond dimension 2, right? Now the point is that if you go here to the critical temperature of the 2D classical Ising model, which is given by this, then the correlation length of the classical model is infinite, and therefore, you know, all your 2-point correlation functions decay polynomially fast instead of exponential, so that you have an infinite correlation length. And then you have a PEPs with infinite correlation length. So if you just plug in this value here, there is nothing strange going on, everything is analytical, and it still has bond dimension 2, and still the correlation length is infinite. Okay? So this is very different to what happens in 1D, where you always have a finite correlation length for an MPS. In 2D, you can have, in principle, also infinite correlation length. Yes?
Yeah, are there other examples that have an infinite correlation length?
Yeah, for instance, the example, the PEPs that say Didier Paul Blanc and also Norbert have been constructing for chiral topological spin liquids, they also have an infinite correlation length. Yeah. And the way to check this is by checking the entanglement spectrum. You have a CFT at the boundary and so on, but they are also critical. Yeah. This example is a little bit tricky because one could say that this is a classical state, but this one's about that have some chiral topological order. These are actually quantum wave functions. More questions? Okay, so we can have infinite correlation length, and this is great because it means that in principle with PEPs we could also capture the relevant entanglement properties of some quantum phase transition. Okay, so when we have a critical point with, with an infinite correlation length and it's a scaling variant and so on, in principle this could also work. Good. Now let me tell you a little bit about the connection between PEPs and Hamiltonians. So this is actually also pretty generic. It also is valid for MPS. We can think that, well, we have kind of two different worlds. There is the world of Hamiltonians, and they are living here on the cloud, okay? And there is the world of states. This is where we are, okay? And now the point is that if you are given a generic PEPs with finite bond dimension, it's usually possible to associate something that is called a parent Hamiltonian to it, in such a way that this guy is the ground state of this parent Hamiltonian. And this parent Hamiltonian is just some sum of interaction terms that are local. That's important. Okay? this is a pretty generic property of PEPs. There are some mathematical subtleties here, but in principle, if you have a well-behaved PEPs, let's put it like this holds. Now, the other way around is also, there is also connection there, because it's actually true that if you have a Hamiltonian with local interactions, you can approximate the thermal states by PEPs with finite bond dimension with a very good accuracy. And therefore, if you just lower the temperature more and more, then you get better and better approximations to the ground state. So essentially, there is a connection between Hamiltonians and tensor networks that goes in both directions. So given a tensor network, you can get a parent Hamiltonian. Given a local Hamiltonian in a given dimension, you can also kind of prove that thermal states are well approximated by tensor networks, and in some cases even the ground states, such as for instance the matrix proof states. There are also mathematical proofs for that. And while in the end what this is telling you is that PEPs are targeting the relevant corner of the Hilbert space that is associated with the relevant states of matter that we want to simulate. Okay? So if you remember these pictures that Mari Carmen and Glenn were painting, that we have all this big Hilbert space, and then there is this tiny little corner here that is the one that is relevant for our simulation. So this is kind of justifying that tensor networks, and in particular PEPs and MPS and so on, they are actually targeting this corner of the Hilbert space. Okay? Good. This is a comparison slide, and I think is useful. So in this week, you have heard about MPS. Now I'm telling you about PEPs. We have heard this morning about MERAS, and also these days by Glenn. And this is kind of a comparison of the different properties of these three tensor networks. There are more, but since these are kind of the most popular ones, at least for us. This is a comparison of the properties. For instance, the entanglement entropy of an MPS is a 1D area law, for a PEPs is a 2D area law, and for a MERA, it's an area law in the holographic space. Okay, actually this matches this the Ryuta-Kayagi formula. Okay, from ADS50. The exact contraction of an MPS is efficient. Yesterday, when I was computing all these correlation lengths, at some point I never had any exponential blow up of my tensors. Okay, everything was efficient, and it's just matrix multiplication. For a MERA, the contraction is also efficient in 1D. But if you go to 2D, the contraction is inefficient. Okay, the correlation length of an MPS is finite, whereas for a PEPs it can be infinite, and for a MERA it can also be infinite. Okay, and they are associated to 1D Hamiltonians because here you are in 1D, whereas a PEPs is associated to a 2D Hamiltonian. And while the tensors in an MPS, in principle, you could just plug in here arbitrary tensors, same as for 2D, whereas in the MERA they are constrained because they have to be unitaries and so on. Okay. So you see, depending on what is the structure of your tensor network, the properties that pop out are really very different. Okay? Good. Okay, that was about the basics. Questions so far? Or remarks? No? Okay. Good. So let's talk about computing with PEPs. So now what we would like to do is to pick up PEPs and use it as a variational ansatz to say, I don't know, to approximate ground states of quantum many-body Hamiltonians in 2D, or to approximate time evolution, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we know that we can do it in 1D with matrix proof states, and for instance, to compute ground states, we have DMRZ. If we want to do time evolution, we can do this time evolving block decimation algorithm, but now we want to do the same thing in 2D, okay? Now you will see why, now you will see why I introduced this first transparency, that when you have a PEPs, this is like dancing with an elephant, because if you are more or less familiar with MPS, all the manipulations are fine, but when you go to PEPs, you start hitting all these walls that, oh my god, but now the contraction is inefficient, and now I have an infinite correlation length, and now this, now that, and one needs to handle all these things. So let's start with just considering the PEPs as an ansatz, and let's see how people do a variational optimization. For instance, for a finite PEPs, what we could do is to minimize the expectation value of a Hamiltonian. Okay, and we could minimize this over the family of PEPs. Because of the variational principle, with this we will get an upper bound to the ground state energy, right? And the trick to do this optimization is to do exactly as in DMRZ, so optimize over each tensor individually and sweep over the entire system many times. until we get some convergence. Okay? So we have some peps with energy E. Now we minimize over the first tensor, and we get another peps with a lower energy. Now we minimize over the second, and so on and so forth. Now, at the end, well, we hit the final tensor, and then we sweep again, okay? And keep continuing, and we keep sweeping until the energy keeps going down, 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 until we reach some convergence, okay? Now, at every step in this optimization, say, imagine that we have to optimize with respect to a tensor at side I. What we have to do is to minimize this function up here, okay? So this is the expectation value of the energy minus lambda times the norm, and this is lambda is a Lagrange multiplier, okay? Because I'm introducing this constraint that the state should be normalized, right? Now, one has to realize here that this functional is a quadratic function of the coefficients of my tensor, because this tensor shows up here in the graph and also here in the ket. So this is a quadratic function of the coefficients of the tensor, so we are minimizing a quadratic function, right? And a quadratic function, you can think of it as something that looks like a parabola, okay? So it has a minima, and to minimize it, well, we just take the derivative and make it equal to 0. At the end of the day, you can rewrite this equation after the derivative like this. One can see that what you get out of all this is something called a generalized eigenvalue problem, okay? Something that we call effective Hamiltonian times the tensor, but now I reshape the elements of my tensor as a vector, okay? This is as a relabeling of the coefficients, equals to lambda, which is some number, times some normalization matrix, n, and then times the vector. So if this n were equal to the identity, then what we will have will be just a normal eigenvalue problem. But in principle, this n doesn't need to be the identity, and therefore we have what the mathematicians call a generalized eigenvalue problem. Now, once this effective Hamiltonian matrix and this matrix n are known, once these are known, we can just throw this into whatever subroutine that we have for, generalized eigenvalue problems and solve the optimization problem, and then move to the next. Okay. Now, the question is how to compute these guys. Now, in DMRZ, it's very efficient to get these two matrices. Actually, in DMRZ, you can always make this normalization matrix equal to the identity if you work in the canonical form of the MPS. And then, the optimization is very, very quick, and it's also very efficient to compute this effective Hamiltonian here. But now, we will see that if we want to do it in 2D, this matrix n is always there, and then it's also very, very hard to compute this effective Hamiltonian, but it can be done. So let me show you how to do it. For instance, well, we have this equation, and let me show you how to compute this term of the equation. Okay, so normalization matrix times the vector, so this thing here. So this comes from taking the derivative with respect to this tensor of this piece of the functional, essentially the norm. So let's see, here we have the tensor network, this is the ket, this is the bra. Now I contract everything, and now we have this. Here is the tensor over which I want to optimize. This is AI, this is A star I. And now I'm taking the derivative with respect to this guy, which means that, well, the derivative is going to be just removing this tensor from here. Okay? So it looks like that. This is the derivative, and this monster here is this piece of the equation. Okay? Normalization matrix times A. Now, A is here, which means that all the other contraction corresponds to this normalization matrix. Okay? Now, how can we do this? Okay, so a possible strategy will be to, okay, let's again consider something like that. Let's start from the first row. Let's do the sandwich between the ket and bra tensors. And then I realized that, well, this is exactly a matrix product state. Okay? So then I consider the second row, and this is exactly a matrix product operator acting on a matrix product state. Okay? And then, if I want to contract this, I could do it exactly, and then the bond dimension of the resulting MPS will go up, but then what I should do is to truncate it to keep it low again. Okay? So this is a 1D problem. So in the end, we have mapped the contraction of the 2D lattice to a series of 1D problems. Okay? Essentially, we apply an MPO to an MPS, and we want to find a new MPS with finite bond dimension. So this is a 1D problem, and it means that we are very lucky because we can use our 1D methods for MPS to solve this. Okay, for instance, we can just adapt DMRZ or TBD to deal with this problem. So let's imagine that we just do it, and in the end we end up with some matrix protest state at some point with some truncated bond dimension that I put in red and that I call chi. Okay. Now I do the same thing from below, and I end up with another matrix protest state coming from below, and then the rest of the tensor network looks like this. And now what I have to do to end up here is to contract from the left and from the right, but this is what the people call a zero-dimensional problem because this matrix here, I mean this is like the transfer matrix of an MPS with some tensors in the middle, and what people call this a zero-D problem because this transfer matrix is zero-dimensional, okay? It's just at a point, so I can just contract this exactly, and then I end up with something like that. Okay, so I went from my monster 3D lattice to something that looks like this, just in terms of 8 tensors. So this is a very generic property of all these calculations in two-dimensional tensor networks, and in particular in PEPs, which is that you map the problem contracting the lattice to a series of lower dimensional problems. Okay, so we start with a 2D problem and we map it to a series of 1D problems that we know how to solve using, say, for instance, DMRZ, and we map at the end the problem to a zero-dimensional problem that we know how to deal exactly, and we end up with an approximation to the contraction in terms of a finite number of tensors. So this is a possible strategy to do this, and this is actually how many people do calculations actually. So this piece here is called the environment of the tensor A star I. This is the contraction of all the approximate contraction of all the tensors except this guy. This is called the environment, okay? And now for the other terms in this equation, so for instance, this piece, the effective Hamiltonian times A, so this is computed similarly, but now we have to sandwich with the Hamiltonian, okay? And well, essentially you just proceed in the same way, but with the Hamiltonian in the middle, okay? And for the expectation values, one also proceeds in the same way. Good. Questions about that? So that's how you proceed with the variational optimization. You have to do this at every step in your variational optimization. Yeah.
To solve the generalized algebra problems, the matrix M is always positive definite in this case?
No, and that's actually a point. I mean, it should be positive. It should be positive definite if you didn't do any truncation, okay? But if you introduce truncations, then this guy doesn't need to be positive. And that's a problem in the simulations because sometimes when you get tiny eigenvalues that are not positive, sometimes your simulation goes away. Okay, so this means that you need to increase the bond dimension to reduce the size of these negative eigenvalues that you introduce artificially because of the truncation. Yeah. This also depends a lot on choosing a gauge of the tensors here. So this I didn't mention, but it's actually, I mean, you could just work with arbitrary tensors, or you can also fix the gauge. And there are some gauges that are better suited to, that make this matrix actually much better condition. Okay, so for instance, Mari Carmen has a paper about that with Michael, and we also check that also for infinite systems. Okay. More questions? So you see, in 1D, this matrix here is the identity. You don't have to worry about it. This contraction is efficient. But now you go to 2D, and you cannot get rid of this matrix N. It can also have negative eigenvalues, and you have to do all this mess at every optimization step. Okay, so this is what I meant with dancing with an elephant. You have to start, like, you have to care about many different things at the same time. Okay. Good. Now let's talk about time evolution. Okay, and we can do time evolution in real time, and then we can simulate dynamics, or we can do time evolution in imaginary time, and then we just have another algorithm for approximating ground states. So the idea is essentially the same as in 1D. For instance, this is an example of what you get for imaginary time evolution. And well, this is the Hamiltonian, this is my imaginary time, and now the ground state can just be approximated by the fixed point of the evolution. And now the trick is to divide this evolution into small time steps, delta tau, and then we just do concatenate many of these tiny little steps, okay? And we just keep evolving in the imaginary time, okay? So we apply one step here, we go to another state, we apply again, and so on and so forth, and we just keep on going. Now let me tell you how this works for a very specific case, but which is quite representative. We just have a square lattice, okay, and we have a Hamiltonian that is made of 2 body nearest neighbor interactions, and then I can just split the Hamiltonian in 4 pieces, like this, for even sides horizontal, these interactions here, odd sides horizontal, even sides vertical, odd sides vertical, okay? Now the nice thing about this splitting is that all the terms inside of each one of these operators commute with each other, okay? Because they are non-overlapping. Now, for instance, let's imagine that we have this piece here. Now what we do is, well, for a tiny little time step delta t, if delta t is very small, we can approximate this by using a Trotter decomposition, just like that, and then corrections are of order delta t squared, but one could also consider higher orders, that's not too much of a problem. And now, inside of each one of these operators, since all the terms in the Hamiltonian commute with each other, the exponential of all these guys is decoupled in terms of a product of operators, okay? So for instance, this guy is just the product of what we call 2 body gates, okay? And it looks like this. And now we apply this to our PEPs, and this is what we have, okay? And now the point, or the main idea, is to say, well, this is the exact state after the evolution. I could just do this exact contraction and get a different PEPs, and I want to approximate this by another PEPs that has the same bond dimension as the initial one, okay? Because if I just do this, it's very easy to see that the bond dimension of the PEPs, in principle, will go up. And what I want to do is to truncate it in some finite bond dimension that I call B. Now, there are many different tricks to do this approximation. You could just do a variational approximation, for instance, for finite PEPs, sweeping through all the sides, minimizing this squared function. This is what the people call, for instance, the full update. If you have an infinite PEPs, you could do this sweeping over the tensors in your unit cell, and it's also the full update. But there are simplified versions of this update that are called, I mean, there are things, for instance, called like the simple update and so on, that I'm sure that you will also hear about this in the forthcoming weeks, where this approximation is not so accurate, but it's much more efficient and therefore can be implemented much faster, but it works partially well because when you go close to a quantum critical point, it's not warranted to be okay. Okay? So there are things like the full update, okay, where we minimize the distance between these 2 guys. If we do it for a finite system, as I said, you just sweep over everybody. If you do it for an infinite system, you sweep over the tensors in your unit cell. And the point is that every time you have to compute this for a full update, of course we are minimizing this square distance, but when you take the square of this, you start having overlaps between wave functions. And to compute these overlaps, we need to do all the approximations that I was saying before to contract these 2D lattices, okay? So at every step in your time evolution, you have to do calculations of environments like the one that I showed you before. So every time that you have a 2D tensor network, you have to approximate it by a series of 1D problems that you solve approximately using some generalizations of DMRG and so on and so forth. Okay, so there is really a concatenation of problems, and you have to do this at every step in your algorithm. And of course, then you have to repeat this many times until your PEPs essentially converges. So this is the main idea for doing time evolution in 2D. Questions? It's the same essentially as in 1D. Okay. Now let me tell you a little bit about how to deal with infinite PEPs. Because so far I was essentially assuming that I had a finite system, but I told you that one can also play with infinite systems if you just have a unit cell and this is repeated everywhere. So I want to tell you about the basic ideas to compute environments with infinite PEPs. And essentially there are different types of methods that one could use. So we have finite PEPs where you could have different tensors everywhere in your lattice, but now if you have infinite PEPs, for instance, we will have just the same tensor repeated everywhere. And the key is that we have translation invariance, so we could consider we have an infinite 2D system. And now if I want to repeat the calculations of these effective environments and things like that for an infinite system, then I have something like this. This is my ket, and it's an infinite system. And this is my bra, and it's also infinite. And now I have to contract all these indices, and there are infinitely many. Okay? So now I do again this sandwich between the tensors in the ket and the bra, and I get again this 2D lattice where each one of these links, remember, is a double index. There is an index going from the get and another one from the left. Okay? Now let's put this on the plane, and because it's much more convenient, because now this is just a 2D structure, okay? And of course, the calculation of any environment that we have to do, and this includes local expectation values, approximations, say, meaning calculation of distances to approximate time evolutions, and all these kind of things. We'll have to compute environments, and this means that we'll have to do contractions of infinite lattices in 2D of tensors. Okay? Now, how do we do this? I mean, it looks like very complicated because we have a 2D lattice, which was already difficult for a finite system, but now it's infinite. Okay? So let's see how do we start with this. No? So the point is that this can actually be approximated, and there are different strategies for this, and I'm sure that also next week we will hear a lot about this. One possibility is to say that, well, this is just the multiplication of many times all the tensors along this row. Okay? And this is a 1D transfer matrix. It's 1D because it spans along one direction. I just multiply many times this 1D transfer matrix, and then I just get the whole lattice. Okay? Which means is that, well, if I put here some initial vector, and I multiply this vector by this matrix many times, this is going to go to the eigenvector that corresponds to the eigenvalue that is maximum in absolute value. Okay? What yesterday I was calling for MPS the dominant eigenvector. So, well, one can just do it. One can pick up this 1D transfer matrix and think about the schemes to compute the dominant eigenvector of a 1D transfer matrix. Now it turns out that this can be approximated well using infinite MPS. Okay, and there are many different schemes that one will apply here, ITVD, IDMRG, and so on. So it's possible to find this dominant eigenvector for an infinite system. And once you have this, essentially you can just proceed as below. You do it from up, from down, and then you have the contraction of an infinite 1D system. But this is also possible, okay? Just because then you have the infinite, well, you have a 1D matrix, a 0D transfer matrix. So this is an approximation. This is what people call boundary MPS methods. It's like you put an MPS at the boundary, you multiply many times until convergence, and then you get an approximation to your environment. There are other methods that are based on ideas of real space renormalization group. For instance, tensor renormalization group, SRG, this higher order singular value decomposition, tensor network renormalization that Glenn was explaining. The idea there is to essentially coarse-grain your lattice, right? We start multiplying tensors together like this, define some effective tensor, and keep coarse-graining the lattice, introducing some extra truncations until we get some convergence. This is also possible, and it also works very well. And another possibility, which I will explain in a little bit more of detail, is to use corner transfer matrices. Now, the corner transfer matrix is the contraction of all the tensors at a corner. Okay? This is actually something that was introduced by Rodney Baxter in 1968 in the context of exactly solvable models for classical statistical mechanics. He was trying to solve things like, the 2D Ising model and many other more complicated models that are exactly solvable. And he developed this idea of the corner transfer matrix. And the nice thing about the corner transfer matrix is that it has very nice spectral properties. So this is something that it was realized very early in the 60s. Now, we can use it here, and it turns out that it tries to a series of methods that work very well. There is something called the corner transfer matrix renormalization group, but I'm pretty sure that Tomotoshi Nishino may be talking a little bit about that. So that's the idea. The idea is to go from this to something that looks like that. Okay? This is what we call renormalized corner transfer matrices. Essentially, we approximate the contraction of these infinitely many tensors by a small matrix, okay, with some finite bond dimension. And then for these guys here in the middle that are called half row or half column transfer matrices, so we essentially do the same thing. As I said, Tomotoshi Nishino may also be talking about that. Now, this is very nice because when you implement it numerically, it's actually faster than the 1D methods of finding the dominant eigenvector of a 1D transfer matrix. Okay, so this works very well, and it's a nice way of approximating contractions of 2D systems. Let me give you an example of how one could do this. We just start with some initial tensors here, and now instead of trying to contract the lattice from the outside to the inside, what we do is, well, we start with a small cluster, and we start adding tensors inside, okay, until we grow up the whole lattice, okay? And this is what we do. For instance, we start with this guy, and now we add a column, right? Looks like this. And the next thing that we do is, well, this is the tensor network with one more column, but now we renormalize it like that, okay? Now we have to truncate these indices, so we compute some isometries that truncate these indices into some finite one dimension, okay? And how to compute these isometries, there are several prescriptions for that, and we can also discuss about that if you are interested, but now the point is that I can just redefine new renormalized coordinate transfer matrices like this and recover the structure that I had at the beginning, okay? With some new tensors here on the left. Now this is an example of what we call a left move, but you can just now repeat this along the 4 directions of the lattice. You can also insert tensors along, say, the diagonals of the lattice. You can do many, many different things. And you just repeat this thing, essentially generating the whole lattice from the inside to the outside until you reach convergence of your coordinate transfer matrices here. Or to be more specific, of the eigenvalues of the coordinate transfer matrices. Okay? So this is an example of what the people call coordinate transfer matrix methods to compute environments in 2D systems. Yeah?
So even though all the tensors are the same,
Yeah.
still spontaneous symmetry breaking can happen.
Yeah.
So which enlarges the unit cell. So
Yeah.
if that happens, then how do we overcome this?
You can, well, essentially, if you have a finite size unit cell, you can also generalize this thing. I mean, this was for the simplest case in which we only have one tensor here. But if you have if you have a unit cell of tensors, essentially what you do is you introduce the whole unit cell, okay? Instead of, I mean, you could think of this tensor here as having a fine-grained structure in terms of, I don't know, 4 different tensors.
Well, we don't know before contract.
No, I mean, of course, you don't know how the symmetry of your state is before doing the simulation, but this is an input to your simulation. You start with a PEPS, and you say, okay, I'm going to use this unit cell, okay? Say a 2 times 2 unit cell, or a 4 times 4. And then you do the simulation with that, you get a series of results, and then you change the unit cell and see if anything changes, okay?
I have a question. Two-dimensional quantum system obeys the ideal about entropy.
Yes.
If we apply this type of approximation, how related the effective of this method?
Well, it's like simulating, it's like computing the ground state of a 1D system, let's say. If you want to compute, let's imagine the following situation. Imagine that you want to compute the ground state of a 1D system, and you do it by, say, you start with an MPS, and now you do evolution in imaginary time. Okay? You do all these Trotter decompositions and so on, and if you paint the whole tensor network, it's a 2D tensor network. Okay? And now, when you just start multiplying with the MPS, like this, until convergence, and then you get your ground state, this is like contracting a 2D tensor network, which is what I'm doing here. So these methods work as long as the boundary MPS that you get when you do this contraction can be represented well with a small bond dimension, which will be the equivalent of having, I mean, it will be equivalent to saying that your one-dimensional transfer matrix is something like the exponential of a 1D Hamiltonian with a gap. Okay? So there is no guarantee to say that you can do this with a very good approximation if you keep this guy finite. Okay? But in actual numerical simulations, what you see is that you can keep this guy finite and pretty small, and you can approximate this very well. Okay? Did I answer your question? So pick up, let's see, have too many seconds here. Imagine that you have, so what you want to do is this. Okay? We start with a boundary MPS and evolve below. Now you can understand this MPO here. Okay. Let's imagine that you write this as the exponential of some Hamiltonian. Okay. What I'm saying is that this is going to go to the ground state of this operator. And as long as this operator is local and capped in 1D, okay, you can approximate the ground state by an MPS with finite bond dimension.
I see.
Okay? And this is what is happening here. That nobody guarantees you that that should happen for the tensors that you get from a PEPS, but it looks like in many practical situations that's what happens. Okay?
This Hamiltonian always gapped.
This one, no, it could also be gapped. So if you have a PEPS with infinite correlation length, then you should get the infinite correlation length from here. And what it means is that you cannot approximate this exponentially well, let's say, with a finite bond dimension. Okay?
I see.
So there is kind of a concatenation of ideas that tell you why this should work. Or better to say, if you see this working, then it's like reverse engineering. Then you think, okay, then the PEPS that I'm getting probably what means is that this operator is the exponential of some Hamiltonian that is local and is gapped. Okay? More questions? Okay. So, yeah, this is an example of how one proceeds with coordinate transfer matrix methods. This is a typical example, just to show you that these things actually work. This is a typical example of an old calculation from 2011. But it's quite representative since before I was talking about the toric code. If you have the magnetic field, an arbitrary magnetic field to the toric code, well, the point is that the model is no longer exactly solvable. You want to compute the ground, say the ground state phase diagram, and we did it with PEPS, okay, using these coordinate transfer matrices and so on that I was explaining to you here. And one gets very nice data, and well, this is just to encourage you that it really works. Okay, it's not that, I mean, it looks very difficult, but you do it and it works. Okay, so let me move to the next point, which is about how to simulate fermions in 2D systems. Let's see, so we know that fermionic systems are, so far everything that I said also yesterday about matrix protestates was essentially for spins, okay? Or for bosons, for variables that commute with each other. So how we want to simulate fermions, because you know matter is made of fermions, so better we have a way to simulate it, okay? But we know that it's very difficult because well, at least in you know, in quantum Monte Carlo we have something called the sign problem, okay? Is that you have to sample something like negative probabilities, and that's not good, okay? And it's still bad because, for instance, you know, we would like to solve things like the fermionic Hubbard model to know about high TC superconductivity. We would also like to do lattice gauge theories in, say, in 2D, 3D, and 3+1 dimensions because, you know, we have fermions, okay? We have electrons there, and we need to know how to do fermions. So, you know, fermions are monsters from the point of view of quantum Monte Carlo. This is the closest thing that I could find to a monster nowadays, okay? But the point is that there is some hope, okay? Now, there are many different ways of describing how to do fermions in 2D systems. So there was kind of a boom around 2010 where, you know, different people just proposed different strategies. In the end, it turns out that all these strategies are equivalent. And what I will explain you here is a particular proposal that works pretty well and is very nice to understand. So let's see, we have bosons. We know that bosons commute with each other. So if I interchange the quantum states of the positions of two bosons, and wave function is symmetric at the level of bosonic operators, the operators commute, and you know, life is easy. But now we have two fermions, and you know, the wave function is antisymmetric. If we just swap the two fermions, and at the level of fermionic operators, what it means is that we get a -1 if we commute them, okay? So the anti-commutator is 0 here, and here the commutator is 0. Now, at the level of the tensor network, what it means is that every time that I have a crossing of two fermionic degrees of freedom, we'll see what it means. So if I have bosons, I have to do nothing, but if I have fermions, sometimes I may get a -1. And now the whole point about simulating fermions is to realize when do you have to introduce a -1 in your contraction to take into account that you are anti-commuting two fermionic operators in the picture of second quantization. Okay, that's the whole point. So this problem is complicated, but it can be solved. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, everything reduces to two very simple rules, and this is kind of a recipe that you can just apply to your tensor network algorithm to fermionize it. Okay. The first rule is to use parity-preserving tensors. So parity is a well-defined symmetry of fermionic Hamiltonians, whether the number of fermions is even or odd. And then what we do is we introduce we use tensors that are invariant under parity transformation. So a parity operator, this is nothing but a generalization of a sigma z. Okay, it's a diagonal matrix with +1 if we are in the even parity sector and -1 if we are in the odd parity sector. Okay, and to be symmetric means that, well, if I apply this parity operator to all the open indices of a tensor, I just get the same tensor. So the tensor is invariant. Okay. This is a symmetry of the Hamiltonian, and therefore, well, it makes sense to incorporate it at the level of the tensors. Now, the second rule is to use what we call fermionic swap case. And this is a little bit tricky, but in the end, the idea is very simple. Every time that we have a crossing of lines in my tensor network, so I have a tensor network and I paint it, okay, on the plane of the slide, okay? And when I paint it, well, I will have some crossings of wires, right? I will have to cross lines here, there, and so on. So now the point is, every time I have a crossing, what I say is, let's introduce another tensor. And this tensor is what we call a fermionic swap, okay? And it's given by this, and essentially what this is doing is that every time that I have two incoming odd sectors, and it's giving me also odd sectors here, I have to introduce a -1, okay? Now, this -1 is what comes from the fact that we are anti-commuting an odd number of fermionic operators with another odd number of fermionic operators in second quantization, okay? And at the end of the day, at the level of tensor network diagrams, it all amounts to just introducing this tensor every time that I have a crossing. End of the story. Okay? So it's very complicated to get there, but in the end, the picture is very, very simple. So the message is, so if you have a, say, I don't know, a 2D PEMS algorithm that works very well for spins, now you fermionize it using these two rules, and you can run it for fermionic Hamiltonians in 2D. Okay? Now, the nice thing about this approach is that it's quite easy to see that the leading order of the computational cost is actually the same as for bosons. So really, simulating fermions is not harder than simulating bosons, and well, they have the same leading cost in the computation. Now, let me be a little bit more specific about what I mean by the crossings. The point is that the fermionic order in second quantization has to do with the graphical projection of the terms. And what I mean is the following. Of course, there are many different ways of painting your tensor network in 2D, okay, in the plane. And for instance, if I have a 2D PERS, I could just paint it like that, okay? And the reason why I put these indices here is because these are my physical degrees of freedom, and this is the ordering of my fermionic operators in second quantization, okay? This is mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, And what it means is that, well, I have the 2D lattice, but I'm ordering the modes in second quantization exactly like this. Now, if I choose a different ordering to represent the quantum state in second quantization, of course the physics doesn't change, because this choice of ordering is just a gauge degree of freedom, so it just goes out when you compute expectation values, but the wave function is different, okay? But the expectation values are the same if you just change the ordering. So if we choose a different ordering, let's say if we choose something like this, what this means is that, well, we are just having a different projection of the PERS in 2D, okay? Now we have this ordering, okay, which is different from this one, and this one amounts to that one, this one amounts to this one, and now we see that we have a different structure of crossings, okay? What it means is that, well, there are going to be a number of relative -1s between these coefficients and these coefficients, but these relative -1s are exactly the ones that you need to go from one fermionic order to the other. Okay? So if I have to go from this ordering to this ordering, I have to start anti-commuting fermionic operators. Okay? I will just start getting -1s here and there. And the -1s that I get, what I say is that are the ones that are accounting for the difference between this coefficient and this other coefficient. Now the point is that physics is independent of which order you choose for your fermionic operator, so that's just a way of representing a state of fermions. But now when you go compute expectation values, it doesn't matter whether you choose this order or this one. They just give the same result. And since the physics is independent of the order, at the level of the diagram, what it means is that it's independent of the graphical projection. So you can just work with a PERS like this, with these crossings, or with a PERS like that, with those crossings, and yeah, you will get different coefficients for your tensors. But when you compute expectation values, you have to get the same numbers, okay? Because you can really go from one to the other when you compute the expectation value. Now, if you know what is a Jordan-Wigner transformation, this is just a different choice of string for mapping your fermions to spins, okay? Of course, physics does not depend on how you choose this string. So this is what this means. Questions?
So that kind of projection also works for infinite size system?
Yeah. It does, and I will show you later why.
Oh, okay.
It's a bit tricky, but the idea is that you can account all these crossings locally, and therefore you can just extend your tensor network to infinity. Yeah. And then you can do infinite systems. Actually, I think this is the next slide. Okay? Good. So here's an example. Imagine that I want to compute the scalar product of a small peps. Okay, 3 times 3. So this is my scalar product. In terms of the full wave function, this is what we have. Okay? And now these are fermions, okay? So these are ordered like this from left to right. This is mode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So I have to respect this ordering, okay? In terms of a peps, this is what I have, okay? This is the ket, and now this is the bra, and to be mathematically correct, I have to match it like this, okay? So I have to do like the specular projection of whatever I have here to keep the order, okay? Now, if I have bosons, I just don't care about this, and then I just paint the tensor networks that I had before. But if I have fermions, I have to do it like this. Now, playing with the parity symmetry, turns out that we can just move the lines around in the tensor network, and it's actually possible to rewrite this guy like that. Okay? And now I realize that, well, if this object here is the guy that is being repeated everywhere, if I just have a bigger lattice. Okay? And if I just contract these two tensors together with these fermionic crossings, I get another tensor that doesn't have any fermionic crossing anymore, right? And now this is very easy. This is a bosonic tensor network, and I just contract it as for bosons. Okay? So this is very interesting for two reasons. First, because we can see that we can get rid of all the fermionic crossings locally, okay? And which means that we can just extend the thing to the thermodynamic limit. Okay, I can just repeat this tensor everywhere. And the second thing is that, well, just by playing with this, we see that in the end, this is just like contracting bosons. I have to manipulate a little bit more, but, well, this is a subleading correction. Okay? So this is the reason why we can also do fermions with tensor networks in 2D. Good. Now, you may wonder whether this actually works, and I will tell you that yes, but you wouldn't believe me, so better you believe Matthias Treuer, okay? He actually said that, IPEPs with fermions work very well, and they are getting the best variational energies for the Hubbard model. And I'm convinced that Philippe Corvos is going to be talking about this. So this is a plot by him, and actually using this fermionic infinite PEPs approach, he was able to get the best variational energies for the Hubbard model in the strong coupling limit, and this is a particular plot that he got. So the approach works, and it's actually one of the best methods that we have now to simulate fermions in 2D. Yeah?
Discussing with Philip about this, then discussing with Philip about this result last year, that the results depend very much on the size of the unit cell.
Yes.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
And even here, this last curve is still not converged, and then there is a question if you choose a larger unit cell, whether the physics will change.
It means that he can even do better, no? So.
Hopefully now he can even do even better, but the problem is that IPEPs is easy because all the tensors are the same.
Yeah.
But it depends, now the physics depends on the choice of the.
It depends a lot on the choice of
unit
units.
If you don't include all the correlations because it's too small or you exclude something at the beginning, then of course you will have a totally different physical picture.
Yeah, that's true. So I mean, there are many degrees of freedom.
You must be careful. I agree that.
Yeah.
But I think that we must be careful.
There are many degrees of freedom. One is to play with the unit cell, with the bond dimension of the environment, with with the bond dimension of the PEPs, with whether you use the simple update or the full update or something else, or whether you coarse grain your system using, TRG or corner transfer matrices. So all these are variables. But what you say is true. So the size of the unit cell for this particular problem is very important. Okay, and I know that he has some very large unit cells, but still he's getting the best variational energies. So, but I agree with you, and I also believe it that one can still improve a lot the simulations. So there is still room for getting much better numbers. Okay, good. And well, I just wanted to cite this, and actually I got permission by Matthias Treuer to put this in here. So that's also good. Okay, so questions? No? Okay, so let me just mention about a couple of some other further topics, and then we can just discuss about other things. So the first one that I want to tell you is about something called entanglement Hamiltonians. That, well, it's actually, the entanglement, you know that the entanglement spectrum is the spectrum of eigenvalues of the reduced density matrix, and you can understand it as the spectrum of some Hamiltonian, and this Hamiltonian is called entanglement Hamiltonian. Okay? Now it turns out that PEPs are a natural tool to understand these objects, and they give you a very nice ball boundary correspondence that I will just explain in a second. So let's come back to bosons, okay? And imagine that we have a 2D system like that. Now, I want to compute the following thing. I want to compute this expectation value, and now we do like before. We have double indices, we put it on the plane. And now I want to do the following thing. I'm going to introduce an artificial boundary here. Okay? This could be like the boundary that I introduced to compute entanglement entropy. Okay? It's artificial, but it just introduces it. And now I wonder, well, how is the physics described here at the boundary? What are these degrees of freedom telling me? In other words, what I would like to do is the following. Say if I have a prescription for computing expectation values from the PEPs, is there some quantum state in 1D here that I could just use to compute the same expectation values but on an associated 1D system? That's the kind of idea. Okay? It's kind of, you know, it's thinking about a little bit like there must be some holographic principle here at work that tell me that, well, I can just compute expectation values here, and it's like computing the expectation values in the bulk of the 2D system. Okay? Also in connection to what we were doing before. So it can be done. I mean, the state that we have in here, we know that it has to be the dominant eigenvector of this 1D transfer matrix for an infinite PEPs. This, we have talked about that before. And this can be approximated by an infinite LPS by using many different techniques. But now I want to do the following. I want to pick up this guy, and remember that these indices are double, so there is one coming from the ket, another one coming from the bra. So what I do is I separate them, just like this. And now I have an MPO, okay, a matrix product operator, with different types of indices. I have virtual indices for the bra, virtual indices for the ket, and I have a boundary virtual index that goes up to chi. Okay? Now, the point is that if chi is large enough, in principle, if chi is infinite, it should be exact, but if we truncate it, then this object doesn't need to be positive, but in principle, if chi is sufficiently large, this guy has to be positive, and also Hermitian by construction, because it's coming from the contraction of something times the dagger. Okay, so it has to be Hermitian, right? And of course, if you truncate it, you may have some correction to this, but in principle, for sufficiently large chi, this is what should happen. So you know you have Hermitian and positive definite operator, and you can understand this as a reduced density matrix. Okay? And in particular, you can understand it as a thermal reduced density matrix of some operator, okay? And we call this entanglement Hamiltonian. Now, this entanglement Hamiltonian is something that is living here in 1D, okay? And has some degrees of freedom that are capital D dimensional, right? Now, the question is, well, who the hell is this entanglement Hamiltonian? And now, this is kind of the result, okay? But this is based on casuistics, studying many different examples, and as far as I know, there are not too many theorems concerning this. But the point is that there is a very nice bulk boundary correspondence, okay? So if we start with the ground state of a 2D system on a gap phase, say something that doesn't have any, well, and also trivial phase, something that doesn't have any intrinsic topological order or anything like this, what people have seen numerically is that this entanglement Hamiltonian is a 1D Hamiltonian with short-range interactions, okay? Something like, you know, local interactions and so on. If you go to a critical 2D system in the bulk here at the boundary, what you get is a 1D Hamiltonian, but this time it's long range, with long range interactions. If you have topological order, then you get projectors here, something completely non-local. And if you have chiral topological order, and if the bulk is also couplets, such as these proposals for topological, chiral topological PEPs, actually what you get at the boundary is something like a discretization of a conformal field theory in 1 plus 1 dimensions. Okay? So there is a very nice correspondence here between properties of the bulk and properties of the boundary. And you know, this gives like a very nice this is a very nice example of the holographic principle. So I would say that tensor networks, and in particular PEPs, they are holographic by construction. Okay? Properties of the bulk, you can map them to properties of the boundary. And we also know how to construct the operator that maps things from the bulk to the boundary. So we know how to construct isometries that pick up, say, an operator in the bulk and map it to an operator in the boundary, and so on and so forth. So all these things, we know how to do them numerically. Yeah?
So just to see if I understand correctly, so this row here is just one row of entire PEPs.
Yeah.
And
well, it's a contraction of, let's say, half an infinite PEPs. This guy.
So
let me go back. So I have this guy.
oh.
And now say I cut it here, okay? But what I do is ta, okay? So I introduce this thing here, and now I contract everything up to here, and I get this MPS. But it has double indices, okay? Because it's coming from here. There is one index from the ket and one index from the mat. Okay? So it has double indices. And now what I say is, well, this is an operator.
Yeah.
Okay? And it's positive, it's Hermitian, so this is a reduced density matrix. And actually one can prove that this is the reduced density matrix of the degrees of freedom that you have here at the bottom. This is exactly how you will compute. Okay? And now the point is that, well, there is this correspondence between properties on the bulk and properties at the boundary. Yeah?
How does the temperature come in here? I mean, there must be some temperature somewhere.
Yeah, there is a prefactor here in general. It depends on the overall scale that you define. So I mean, you normalize your reduced density matrix to having trace 1, okay? And then say you expand this guy in terms of, I don't know, a complete basis of operators for some capital D-dimensional system, and from there, you kind of reach some temperature.
Yeah, so I wonder, maybe it could be possible that the critical 2D system just corresponds to short-range 1D Hamiltonian at 0 temperature. I mean.
No, but then you wouldn't get an operator here. Then the degrees of freedom up and down will decouple. So if you have infinite, if you have 0 temperature, then here you just get a ground state. So it's, you should see that this, I mean, these bond dimensions will decouple into one for the ket and another one for the bra.
Okay.
But that's a good point, yeah.
So, I mean, you say critical 2D system doesn't correspond to the 1D, such 1D Hamiltonian at 0 temperature?
No. It's well, all the people interpret it as something having long-range interactions. But this is built from casuistics, okay? So there is really no fixed theorem, but this seems to be the picture that is popping up.
Okay.
Now this also has some interesting implications for contracting PEPs, okay? Because what this is telling you is that, imagine that I have a 2D local Hamiltonian in 2D, okay? Then if this is true, then what happens is that the state at the boundary has to be a thermal state of a one-dimensional Hamiltonian with short-range interactions. And I just told you before that there is a theorem that says that the thermal states of 1D Hamiltonians with local interactions can be approximated by MPOs, okay, with exponential accuracy. And therefore it means that, well, this picture should be correct. It should be possible to get this guy with a finite bond dimension. So intuitively, this is telling you why the whole picture works and why you don't need an exponential amount of time to contract a PEPs. But as we were discussing before, there was a paper like this week now that said that, well, you can do this in quasi-polynomial time. But it's something difficult to prove mathematically, but the intuition goes along this direction. Okay? More questions?
Can you describe a critical system by using PEPs?
Yes.
So what's the difference critical case and gap case from the viewpoint of?
From the point of view of the tensor? No. Well, that when you contract when you compute this boundary MPS, if it's a gap system, then this boundary MPS will have a finite bond dimension because you have a finite correlation length. But if you have a critical system, then this boundary MPS will have an infinite bond dimension, and then you cannot have it. Okay. So therefore, your approximation is much worse.
Bond dimension.
Yeah, the bond dimension of the environment. Okay, of the MPS that you put to contract your environment.
I think you could also point out, I don't think there's any local characterization. You can't just look at a tensor
no, that's true.
of the PEPs and calculator belongs to.
The only thing you can do is to compute the correlation length. Yes. And but to compute it, you have to go through all these things and see that there is a scaling that brings you to an infinite correlation length. Unless you can build the wave function explicitly, like as I did before, and you know that by construction it has an infinite correlation length, and then you know. Okay. Yeah.
So what's the situation then with as to whether the entanglement spectrum has a gap or not? As to whether there's a
What's
Is there some connection with the boundary with whether the entanglement Hamiltonian has a gap or not?
Oh. I don't know. I would say that, well, if your system is chiral in 2D, then it needs to be something like a chiral conformal field theory, and therefore it needs to be gapless.
Right. I agree that one kind of applies it.
But otherwise I don't know. Yeah. I agree. More questions? Yeah.
How much does the boundary Hamiltonian depend on the type of cut?
In the type of what?
The type of cut. So you cut the latticing half.
As far as I know, not much. I mean, if you have something like an infinite system and it's translational invariant, in principle, I mean, what people do, the type of calculations that people do here is they have an infinite system, but they wrap it around a cylinder, okay, and they have an infinitely long cylinder, and then they cut the cylinder in two halves, and then they contract half of the infinite cylinder, and then they see what is the entanglement spectrum that they get at this boundary, okay. And then, well, the system is still translation invariant along this direction, and therefore they have momentum, okay, and then they just check the entanglement spectrum as a function of momentum, and then they say, oh, then we have this entanglement Hamiltonian or the other. This is how the people do the numerics, but I don't know of any work that has checked how this depends on the particular cut that you do.
But in that case, if I may, I think the contraction is exact, right? So the cylinder is small enough that you can do this contraction.
If the cylinder is small enough, yes, but if you want to do very large cylinders, then you have to do the contraction with MPS.
But this works when they do this short.
The first one, yes. But for instance, for these chiral things, they did the contraction of the cylinder using an MPS with periodic boundary conditions. More questions? Okay. So now let me go to the last topic, which actually is a very general topic. It's not just about PEPs. It's about how to implement symmetries in tensor networks, and it's going to be just 2 slides. Okay, I'm going to be very brief and very schematic, but I think it's important to get an idea of this, because this is also important for MPS, for instance. The point is the following. If we have a symmetry on our system, then it's, say, for instance, SU2. Then it's a very good idea to implement it also at the level of the tensor networks, and the easiest thing is to demand that all the tensors in your tensor network are also invariant under this symmetry, okay? This is an example of a symmetric system, of a symmetric tensor, or an invariant tensor, okay? We just have these operators here that are, matrix representations of whichever size of that my indices have here, of the corresponding unitary operators that implement the symmetry. And well, we have some legs because we can have incoming and outgoing indices to know, because we will have here U or U dagger. And this is what it means to be an invariant tensor under a given symmetry. So we just apply the operators of the symmetry, and the tensor remains invariant. Now there is a theorem in say in group theory that is very well known. Actually, it's a lemma, it's short lemma, and if you just apply it, at the end of the day, and this is just the summary of the result, what it means is that if you have a tensor that is invariant under a given symmetry, under some given symmetry operation, what it means is that the tensor coefficients decouple into 2 pieces. Okay? There is one piece that we call it a degeneracy tensor, and then there is another tensor that only depends on the symmetry. Actually, it's made of what the people call the intertwiners of the symmetry group. And for instance, for a matrix, this is just an identity, okay? For a tensor with 3 indices, this guy is some Clebsch-Gordon coefficient, for instance, for SU2, and so on and so forth, okay? So there is a piece that, well, has some degrees of freedom, and then there is another piece that is entirely determined by the symmetry. Now, what this means is that a very large piece of your bond dimension when you have a system with a symmetry is actually coming from the symmetry. It's not coming from the dynamics of your system or anything like that. It's just there because you have a symmetry, okay? And then you can just put this piece by hand, and you can save a lot of computational time in your simulation if you know that this has to be there, okay? Now, as I said, there is a lot of mathematical derivations here, but intuition is that your tensors are split into two pieces. Now, when you put this into a tensor network, so you know, we start with our quantum state, we put it, well, we want to represent it as a symmetric tensor network, and then everything decouples like this. There is a sum over some coefficients that are given by tensor networks of some tensors that we call degeneracy tensors, okay? And then there is another piece of the tensor network that is entirely determined by the symmetry, okay? This is what people call a spin network. And just to make the connection with what we were seeing this morning about, well, there is this interesting connection about quantum gravity and entanglement and tensor networks and so on. This is also a possible connection because it turns out that these guys are, turns out that the people that work in loop quantum gravity represent the loop quantum states of space-time actually by spin networks, right? So, you know, this is a very interesting connection. Here it just shows up because we have a tensor network with symmetries, but actually it's also interesting for the people doing high energy physics. And as I said, there are many, many, many different things that apparently seem to have a connection between entanglement and space-time, and you start reading about all this, and suddenly you become very motivated, no? Because it looks like we are going somewhere, but still. Now here we are just interested about numerical simulation, so we come back to to the real world and try to understand how to use this for our simulations. Now the point is that if you incorporate these symmetries, so it's very easy to see that you have global symmetries, and also you can have gate symmetries like this, and your tensor is invariant, so these global and gate symmetries are handled kind of naturally. But from the perspective of numerical simulations, this is important because you have huge computational savings, okay? Simply because, you know, you don't have to, if you keep track of this guy explicitly at every time, you only need to manipulate this other tensor network, and then everything is much more efficient, okay? And this is what is behind all these algorithms, such as SU2 invariant DMRG, and so on and so forth, that they can reach bond dimensions of 20,000 and so on. So the bond dimension of, say, 20,000 is the combined bond dimension of these two tensor networks, okay? So this is the reason why one can go up very, very quickly with the bond dimension if you incorporate explicitly the symmetry in the tensor network. Okay, so that was the last thing that I wanted to do. There are many, many other things that one could talk about here, but this is kind of never ending. So if you are interested in knowing about anything else, just let me know, or just send me an email, or you can also ask some other speaker that knows about this. And yeah, that's it. So thank you for your attention. Questions or remarks?
So in statistical model, the spectrum of the CTA transform matrix is important to categorize the phase of the system, but in the text, so there's some special information in the spectrum of the transform matrix.
In the PEPs? You mean in the transfer matrix of the PEPs? Or,
yeah, so Kohn transform matrix.
Yes.
So the structure of the algebraic eigenvalues,
yeah,
or the degeneracy, or
yes.
So in the statistical, so classical to the Ising model,
yeah,
the ordered phase and disordered phase can be have different structure.
Yeah.
So in the PEPs, so if the CTM in the ordered phase,
yeah,
so there is some special.
Yeah, structure. I mean there is. We see it numerically, but I don't know how to. I don't know of any analytical work about it. But one can see it numerically, that depending on whether you are close to a quantum critical point or not. I mean, all this decay of, say, the singular values of the corner transfer matrix is very different. Okay, and you can actually relate. Well, you can actually relate it also to to the, okay, so it has to do with the spectrum of the 1D transfer matrix of the PEPs. Yep.
I have a question about this symmetry stuff. So you can, in the presence of symmetry, you can basically decompose one tensor into coefficient bound spin network. But in real actual applications, I don't see so many applications actually using, making maximum use of this symmetric properties. Why is that?
You mean in 2D?
Yeah, in 2D.
Oh, because it's very difficult to program.
Okay. It's just a matter of human time.
Exactly. It's human energy. Yeah. So there are several there are implementations of say SU2 invariant DMRZ. Okay. Say for instance Z and many other people. Okay. And this is why you can implement SU2 symmetry in MPS. But for an MPS, you have tensors with 3 indices, and therefore the SU2, the part of the SU2 tensor, this guy here, this is going to be a Clebsch-Gordan coefficient. Okay. Whereas if you have PEPs, then it's tricky because well, you have, for a square lattice, you have tensors with 5 indices. And therefore you have something here with 5 indices. Okay.
Right.
And then you realize that the optimal way to deal with this is to decompose everything into tensors with 3 legs. Okay. And then you start having structures and so on, and everything becomes quite technically complicated to program. This is the reason why there are few people who have programmed actually, say, SU2 invariant PEPs. But then I know of at least a couple of people who have done it. So, but it's a matter of human energy.
Okay.
I mean, it's getting there. It's just that it takes a lot of time to do this simulation with, say, for non-abelian symmetries. For abelian symmetries, it's much easier to implement.
Right.
But when you start having non-abelian symmetries, it's much more complicated.
Right. Yeah, to what extent we can squeeze the computational complexity? For example,
So, for instance, I know that in 1D with DMRZ, that's a lot. So I mean, Ian, maybe you know exactly. So say if you do a calculation with SU2 DMRZ, compared to a plain DMRZ without SU2, what's the difference between the maximum bond dimensions that you can reach?
Well, I mean, so the saving is the average degree of the representations that occur in the density matrix, and that's typically about a factor 3 or something like that.
But in the end, it's a huge change.
3 cubes, the difference in CPU time.
Yeah.
The question is how many multiplex you have.
Exactly.
The higher the multiplex, then of course the saving is larger.
Yeah.
But it's a question of what is the distribution, including the cat states and all this multiplex. So usually it's again some 2 to 3, but not something that the factor of 10, because you have some higher multiplex. Of course, in that case it can be a factor of 10, but you have only a few of them on the triplets and similar.
But for instance, for all these SU2 invariant simulations, for 2D DMRZ to get this quantum spin liquid on the Kagome lattice, this works by Steve White and Uri Shogun and company. So they have bond dimensions there that go up to, I think, tens of thousands. Okay, and that's a huge bond dimension. I mean, it's really huge, and the reason why they can get there is because they implement SU2. So if you try to just write an MPS algorithm in 2D and try to go to a bond dimension of 10,000, I mean, your computer explodes essentially. So.
I don't think Steve did issue 2 in that way.
No?
I think U1, if you just take into account the U1 part of the SU2 symmetry, you get most of the complex.
Steve, only U1?
Yes, I think he's Steve for the
I don't think
I thought he did SU2.
Most people go through SU2 because you get most of the savings just getting the U1 part of the symmetry.
Okay, but Uli did SU2, right?
Yeah.
Uli did SU2, exactly, and he got much larger bond dimension.
Well, not much.
Well, okay, but it was large.
I mean, there is another reason for that, is that in physics usually we are interested in problems where we go with symmetry anyway, so you introduce a magnetic field and things like that, so the effort that you put into the code you don't use it. But for example, in quantum chemistry, where people want to target a given state with a given symmetry, and you don't have any external fields and things like that, but we are just interested about the ground state and the spectrum or X-ray states. In that case, of course, SU2 is a big saving. So that's why most of the, let's say, quantum impurity models, like in this Kondo model and other, that's also the case where you have usually a great advantage of this SU2, so that it makes an effort to do it, and then you really take advantage of it. But in the general problems, usually you break it anyway, and then.
For instance, in the also another example is in the simulations that I've seen for 2D systems with SU2, I think they can reach bond dimension up to 20, 30, or 20 something like this, which otherwise is pretty hard. Even for the simple update, maybe you can get to 15, but not to 20 something. More questions or remarks? Okay.
Again?